Thank you very much for being here tonight. And in French, we say braver le froid. I don't know what that is in English. So welcome to the third talk of the talk series, Spaces of Contestation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Coast Salish territory. Spaces of Contestation is a project that is realized through Unit Pitt Project's curatorial residency program. And I would like to thank Unit Pitt and Keith Higgins for their support of this project. The project consists in a series of talks, performances, public actions, publications, and an exhibition that examines the collective walk, the protest or the public demonstration as both a performance and as a social formation. The core of the project resides in 4 collaborations between artists and community organizations. And these collaborations initiate community engagement and democratic use of public space via the realization of site-specific participatory performances. The participating artists are Lauren Marsden, Didier Morelli, Gabriel Mindel-Solomon, and the Unlearning Weekenders Collective, formed by Zoe Cray and Catherine Gros. The programming details can all be found on the Unit Pitt website. I'm not going to enumerate them for you right now because there's quite a bit of events, but I encourage you to go look at the website for more detail. And the exhibition and the performance series starts on March 22nd and runs until May 3rd. So I encourage you to attend those as well. So the speaker series, however, is co-organized and co-presented by Unit Pitt Projects, the SFU Vancity Office of Community Engagement, and the SFU Institute for the Humanities. The speaker series is organized in parallel to this project and aims to foster critical discussion around issues of urbanism, community activism, and politically engaged artistic practice. The speaker series, as I said, is co-presented by these 3 organizations, and the project as a whole is supported through the BC Arts Council Arts-Based Community Development Program and by the Hamber Foundation. So Jeff Mann and Jamie Peck were the 2 first speakers of the series, and you can watch video documentation of their talks on both Unit Pitt and the SFU Community Engagement Office's website. But without further ado, let me introduce our speakers of tonight, Urban Subjects. So Urban Subjects is a cultural research collective formed in 2004 by Sabine Bitter, Jeff Dirksen, and Helmut Weber, and are based in Vienna and in Vancouver. Together they devise research-driven artistic projects that are visual and textual, including exhibitions, publications, curatorial work, and presentations. Projects include I Beg Your Pardon, or the Reestablishment of Cordial Relationships, presented at the Veralist Center for Art and Politics in 2005. Not Cheap, New Urban Enclosures and Commons at ArtSpeak in 2006. A collaboration with the Vancouver Flying University at Gallery Gachet in 2008. We Vancouver, presented at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2010. 602,000 Works on Housing, realized at Vivo Media Arts Center in 2011, and Filling the Weak Points, Konstrum, Lunenburg, 2013. They have edited the publication Autogestion, or Henri Lefebvre in New Belgrade, with a previously unpublished manuscript by Lefebvre, published by Philip and Sternberg Press in 2009, and the book Momentarily, Learning from Mega Events, published by the Western Front in 2011. Which was edited by Big Vanderpoel and Alyssa Firth Egeland, 11. Contributed to the Waking Up from the Nightmare of Participation, edited by Nina Valerie Kolowatnik and Marcus Meeson, and Caracas, Socialicierende Stat, edited by Dario Asellini, Stefan Lanz, and Katrin Waldner. In 2013, they were artists in residence at Kunstrum, University of Leuphana in Lunenburg, where they published the artist's book, The Possibilities Are. And they are currently working on an exhibition on the militant image for Camera Austria. So I give you Urban Subjects. Thank you. There will be a question-answer period after the talk, so stay around.
I just wanted to begin by saying that this is a photo of the late Neil Smith, the critical geographer, standing beside the manifesto that we wrote with him for the We Vancouver show. This is just beside the Japanese Cultural Center, just off Powell Street there. We work collaboratively, collectively, the three of us, and we tend to share most things, but the one thing we have not thankfully shared tonight is a cold. So Helmut is the only one of us who has a cold, so his throat is raw, so Sabine and I are going to do the speaking tonight, but we devised the text collaboratively.
Yeah, and so...
hey, you can't speak.
Okay. I'm just saying this is a kind of part of our performative aspect in our work. I'm just sitting here and try not to cough too loud and spray. Sorry.
Thanks everybody for coming out, and thanks Marianne for organizing this series, and for Amjo Hall for his solid work here throughout all of the projects at SFU Woodwards. We thought we would start by making a link with the last talk in the series, Jamie Peck's talk, and just in case people haven't heard me say the word neoliberalism enough recently, I thought I'd give a little of an overview that we devised to make a link between some issues that Peck raised that we feel can situate our work within.
And just a quick note in between, the next photographs we're showing are from the city of Belgrade, New Belgrade exactly, and they are part of our research for a publication of the first project we're going to talk about. So they are uncommented otherwise.
We're going to talk for about 50 minutes, so kind of set your attention spans. So in the last talk of the series, Jamie Peck outlined what neoliberalism is at this moment. So we'd like to use his work as a link to contextualize the cultural moment that we live in. The strength of Peck's take on neoliberalism, and he really is one of the central voices in that, is in showing its developments from rollout to rollback neoliberalism, and to describe how it's both a floating ideology yet place-based. Brazilian neoliberalism is not the same as Canadian neoliberalism. The neoliberalism of Vancouver is not the same as that of Abbotsford, because Abbotsford's perhaps the most neoliberal place. In turning to art and creativity, Peck gave a powerful and at times humorous analysis of how the policy of the creative city has harnessed culture in the service of orthodox urban development. Turning to Vancouver, he argues governance is based on selectively small government with little redistributive capacity, and therefore it doesn't work to redistribute wealth or access to services. So key to this neoliberal governmentality is that cultural policy gets an economic rationale. So as artists working in this city and in other cities, we recognize the way in which culture has moved into a more central place in terms of an economic engine of a city. We, however, take this as a particular problematic to be worked through, as well as an opportunity rather than a strict closing down of the possibilities of art and other forms of cultural production. So why do we figure this? First, this move is not unique. Culture within our lifetimes has always had to negotiate this relationship to the economic. Plus, there is now an entire archive of artists' work who have addressed the financialization of art and of everyday life. And these works range from symbolic practices such as the work of Maria Eichhorn to community-based projects such as Park Fiction in Hamburg, which established a neighborhood park and tried to counter gentrification through neighborhood organizing. So in a link to Peck's work, we do see this as the context that we work within.
And in description of our practice, of what we are trying to do and how we will talk about it tonight, we wanted to point out at the beginning that we do not work on consensus. This indicates how our different backgrounds in art and partially architecture and in poetry and poetics, how this influences our thinking. Also, to work towards consensus would appear to obscure antagonism, both in the process of making the work itself and in the things and places that we look at or we engage with. So we talked for a few contentious hours over the last days about this in preparation for the talk, and we ended up in defining some signposts we necessarily negotiate. First is a position from Pierre Bourdieu in his The Rules of Art. On the one hand, the aim is to reinforce autonomy, notably by forcing the separation of heteronomous producers and by fighting to guarantee cultural producers the economic and social conditions of autonomy in relation to all forms of power. Cultural producers must fight, if only to guarantee themselves the power over the instruments of production, by involving themselves in their own times to assert the values associated with their autonomy. So we thought of this also related to a statement from the artist Christoph Schäfer as a kind of translation of sort of Bourdieu's position. And Christoph Schäfer says, I very much enjoy the art field and define myself as an artist. Even the classical definition of art as autonomous appeals to me. But I do enjoy risking that autonomy. When I joined Park Fiction, it was more interesting to me to place my thinking and artistic activity in a collective urban context. I was sick of the negative dialectic that informed classical conceptual art, where he comes from, and I also have a critical attitude toward a certain breed of relational art, that kind that restricts itself to the poetization of the status quo. So for Helmut and I, this is quite close to the position, how we want to position our practice. Within the intensification of capital into the art world and art market, we can see that these strategies of incorporatization and instrumentalization, also within artistic research, which we will talk about it a bit later, as well as in projects in public space, public art projects, partially with architects or collaborations with urban planners. But we have also worked in artistic research projects close to institutions that kind of cross the dirty line. So sometimes we see it necessary to tactically claim or assert the values associated with autonomy. Even this is just to counter the cuts or deteriorating of the social and economic conditions of cultural producers today. An admirable and politically really intriguing example for this tactical use of the principle of artistic autonomy, I just explained briefly from a group called Rotor, an art institution, a small art institution in Graz, Austria. And they provided war refugees from the Balkan with an artist in residency invitation to subvert the restriction of very harsh Austrian immigration laws. So if people had applied to get to Austria as refugees, they would have been blocked by these restrictive and partially, of course, institutionally racist immigration laws. But Rotor used this exceptional status for the artists to working with community networks and immigration activists to get refugee claimants to Austria who are actually not artists, but through the definition of art. So, yet coming from a poetics background in which the very material one used, language, was not seen as autonomous in any way. So Jeff has different relationship to this artistic autonomy, even in the way that Bourdieu used it as a tool or position to guarantee artists' power over their instruments of production. Rather than the language of autonomy, Jeff finds a use of Herbert Marcuse's idea of non-integration, in which the integrating forces of capitalism are also its disintegrating ones. In these circumstances, the opposition is concentrated amongst outsiders within the established order. So this allows some differentiation within fields. There are outsiders inside, even if they don't want to be, and even poetry is inside capital, therefore it knows this disintegration really well. So autonomization as a process, not autonomy, might be where our negotiations as urban subjects actually meet.
So as a group of artists and a writer, we've tried to use research as a meeting point for different practices and as a tool of sorts for pursuing certain possibilities. So in thinking through the role of research in our practice, we begin with this proposition. Like history, research cannot arrive at a predetermined point. And so framing it historically, we also find it important to locate the notion of artistic research historically. In a text called Art in the Knowledge-Based Polis, Tom Hollert writes, "The moment one enters the archives of writing, criticism, interviews, syllabi, and other discursive articulations produced and distributed within the artistic field, the use of terms such as research and discussion about the politics and production of knowledge are revealed as fundamental to 20th century art, particularly since the inception of conceptual art in the late 1960s. From our perspective or position as an artist collective, we recognize the field of artistic research and its practitioners and the debates within that field and its contestations. So we've tried to identify within that milieu, within those fields, what we call poetic research or research without guarantees. So why research without guarantees? So this refers to the Stuart Hall's 1983 essay, and I understand there's a Stuart Hall movie going on at this moment, which I'm sure is totally terrific. Hall's essay, the essay is called The Problem of Ideology, Marxism Without Guarantees. It's a core text within British cultural studies. And within that essay, he says the goal of ideology is to seek to open the process, or the goal within Marxist theory is to seek to open the process of theorizing, of the development and refinement of new concepts and explanations, which alone is the sign of a living body of thought, capable still of engaging and grasping something of the truth about new historical realities. So we propose that research, turning away from instrumentalization in the academy, in think tanks, and in the art world, must no longer come with guarantees, or as the granting agencies often ask us to fulfill, they must not come with particular outcomes. A tension that we have run into in artistic research is that scientific understandings of research make it difficult to see another value. In an interdisciplinary framework, artistic research falls into and within a scientific evaluation. This can lead to a particular shaping of research within the production of knowledge. So as Helmut Draxler points out, it is necessary to trouble the split of art as a form of expression and research as a form of knowledge production. Yet if art is picked up as knowledge production, then art once again needs to claim a difference from institutionalized knowledge production. At one point, it seemed like a very progressive and liberating move to claim art based on projects, research, and knowledge rather than on expression, the object, and the market. Yet now we can find ourselves being brought into or drawn into and within the capitalization of knowledge and the market of knowledge production. So what better way to stop the closure of and the instrumentalization of research and knowledge than to break the binary of production and consumption? Often research, and artistic research as well, assumes an active producer and a relatively passive consumer or viewer, like the passively figured reader of a poem who consumes the intentions of the poet or the beauty of the poem, or like the viewer of a work of art who is structurally distanced from the artwork and its making. Is artistic research also in danger of making such a model of viewing and reading? Poetic research, following a model roughly from Bakhtin through the language poets of the 1980s, can be thought of as a next step in production. That is, the viewer or reader becomes also a producer. Cultural studies, Lawrence Grossberg in particular, we're thinking of, recirculated the term of productive consumption to describe this. And poetics uses the terms of productive reader and the open text. And perhaps these models would be useful in thinking about poetic research and the circulation of research and the ways it can be used by situated communities. So with this idea as well, we try to think of the reader not as singular but as multiple, particularly as a community. So as the editors of the collection of essays entitled The Constituent Imagination, which is a great anthology, a great gathering, which traces the emergence of militant research in Argentina. As they point out, as new forms of intellectual labor increasingly moves away from the academy, new forms of circulation can only become increasingly important. So we take poetic research to be a means to organize material into a poetics, rather than to bring research into a capitalization of knowledge. Poetics is a building and an ordering in which the aesthetic, the formal, and the semantic are all considered as part of the dynamic. But poetic research is not simply open-ended or outside of other valuations, but it's also a critical understanding of research. Poetic research seeks to make connections between sites, places, events, moments, movements, people, and commodities. Yet it tries to do so without guarantees. Like history, research cannot arrive at a predetermined point.
So with this framework in mind, we would like to approach a book work that we made in 2009 with the title Autogestion, Henri Lefebvre and New Belgrade, as a kind of hub work that several concerns that we have followed up on try to recirculate and to move between sites and communities. The book work is a hybrid of an academic anthology, an archival manuscript, and an artist's book. The book is built around the original manuscript of a 1986 city plan for New Belgrade by French philosopher Henri Lefebvre and two architects, based on the concept of autogestion, or self-management, or self-organization, depending if it's an English, rather English translation or German translation. This manuscript had lingered in the city archives of New Belgrade unpublished. Lefebvre elaborated the idea of self-organization, which was a mode of labor organization in the Yugoslavian socialist project during Tito's time. At that time, it was meant to extend to society as a whole, that there would be a self-organized society that would not require a state apparatus. But then consider the timing of the Lefebvre project. Lefebvre is an old philosopher. He was already 85 years old, with an old idea. Autogestion has been around since the 18th century, and it had died out in France shortly after 1968. And Lefebvre himself cautioned against it becoming an empty slogan. Consider, too, that Tito had been dead already for 6 years, and Yugoslavia was already on the edge of breaking up just 3 years before Milosevic came into power and the Balkan War between 1992 and 2001. So this idea of autogestion has an untimeliness and uneven understanding. It was the state project of a state that no longer existed, and ironically, it was to do away with the state, but it did not leave a self-organized society behind. Instead, at this time, the former Yugoslavia was opened up to then what was called turbo capitalism in its worst formation. Helmut and I before, but then also with Jeff, we started working in Belgrade on different projects from 2006 on, a time when public institutions and governmental structures were almost eroded, and you could say that it was a self-management gone totally wrong, as people organized their lives in the city without any safety nets. So to negotiate the potential of the meaning of autogestion, we reproduced the manuscript in facsimile in French and English, and then accompanied this historically situated text with the contextualizing essays that we commissioned from academics and activists from Serbia, Germany, and the United States. And to not only look at the text as historic, but also to see how this term can be useful today to think about the urban condition and the condition of a citoyen, somebody who is a citizen and lives in a city. What could this text say about the present, and how could it be read, understood, or even used in the present? And as a visual artistic work, we designed 5 separate covers for the book that are also at the same time artist edition. And the questions of aesthetic representation was central. How to visualize a process of autogestion, or a form of organization that actually never was realized. Key in our thinking was the question posed by Sergio Bologna, who, on the question how to represent the invisible, and Bologna works that through in terms of labor. So thinking of the way in which research moves in and out of institutions and the frameworks, this book was also really productive. It circulated in the art world as well as in the academic field and in the field of Lefebvre studies. And from this project on, we also began to look for other places where this idea of autogestion might show up. And in our continued research in Caracas, Venezuela, we knew of self-organized neighborhoods that challenged the state at the same time they used state resources. That is, they seem to have successfully negotiated these contradictions embedded in the idea of autogestion. So we'd like to turn to a project that was research-based in some ways, and also which, in one component of it, tried to bring ideas of self-organization in terms of housing from Gramoven, an area in Caracas, in proximity with the role of real estate in Vancouver.
This project was one that we realized through a residency at Vivo through February through April of 2011. And the title of it is 602,000 Works on Housing. So to frame this, we went back to Lucy Lepard's show from 1969, which she curated, and was one of its instances was shown here. It was a show of, she describes it as wall works, earthworks, and sculptural pieces, as well as more idea-oriented works. So the show caught the emergent moment of conceptual art and traced its north-south relationship, linking the Americas. Initiated in Seattle, it moved through Vancouver and on to Buenos Aires. The show took the population of each city at the moment of the exhibition as it's titled. So the exhibition in Vancouver was simply the number 955,000. Lepard's titles reflected what had become a strong aspect of conceptualism in the late 60s, the turn against expression, as well as a turn towards cultural and social critique. Intriguingly, the titles are both grounded and abstracted. So 41 years later, from the terrain of post-conceptual practices, we use this numerical impulse to frame our work at Vivo. Our number, 602,000, refers to the median house price in Vancouver in 2010, since gone up dramatically. This house price, this home price, that was already then designated as severely unaffordable, as it's almost 10 times the median household income. And as Jamie Peck pointed out in his talk, that relationship in Vancouver is now that it's Vancouver's second highest median household income in relationship to income in the world. Yet why this economic fact is a title for an exhibition? We understand that economic facts are both indexes and distortions of everyday life, and just as Lepard's title grabbed a number that reflected something human as a representation of the city, the number 602,000 reflects the very human relationship of housing, as well as the transformation of public space and the urgency we feel of artistic practices. So in reaching back to refer to a show that's important in Vancouver's cultural history, we also intended to point to a shift in conceptual to post-conceptual practices and a shift in the lived experience of public space. So while Lepard is clear in locating the possibilities of conceptualism at that time of political ferment, a counter-narrative of conceptualism sees its challenges welcomed and absorbed by the very institutions it raised its cultural tools against. One of these processes, we understand that process of absorption, critique and absorption, to be embedded within the processes of culture and capital. And because of that, we feel there's no real failures that can be heroically resurrected in the legacy of conceptualism, and particularly not to heroicize it, which is also to gender it in a particular way. But what possibilities did conceptualism open to later practices? What spaces did conceptualism open that we could play through in a sense? So in writing about institutional critique, Sabbath Buchman defines one such opening. She says, for an avant-garde demand for art as a form of communication that generates publicness. So we picked up on this notion, as other people have, in terms of post-conceptual practices and conceptual practices around the production of publicness. So we feel that this aesthetic social question is made more urgent by a new set of spatial questions regarding publicness itself. And we reject the notion of a static public sphere that negotiates between state and civil society in reasonable debate, which we often don't do ourselves, and instead think of the ways publicness produces public space, or the way that publicness produces space. So it's goodbye Jürgen, hello Henri. So the shift from the public sphere discourse to an idea of publicness and public space brought us to the central organizing friction of 602,000, which is housing. So we looked at housing as the nexus where the possibilities and closures of everyday life intersect, and where the experience of public space is negotiated. Now, this might appear counterintuitive. Why would housing, traditionally associated with the domestic sphere, be the nexus that shapes public space? To put it simply, in an economy that is so nervously tied to the housing market as Vancouver's has become, the building, marketing, sales, and ownership of domestic space determines the possibilities of public space. Private space is produced in conjunction with private housing, and this in turn alters the geographies of daily movement and of access to space, concepts of spatial justice, and the production of public space. So as commodities, housing and notions of dwelling are often stripped of their aesthetic and, let's say, poetic possibilities. So we see the terrain of art as the discursive site where some of these possibilities might be brought back and asserted. Likewise, such practices might spur a political, aesthetic imagination of what housing could do, of what it could be. So we presented a video work from the neighborhood of Gramoven in Caracas, Venezuela. And the video work engages with how the community council there established forms of autogestion, or self-organization, as we're saying, and how they organized all aspects of daily life. They had 9 separate levels that they had their self-organization built around. That was particularly focusing on housing, but also food, everything to sport, family management, and actually to gender relations. There was an extensive public aspect to the show as well, and it included a panel discussion on the notion of dual power that we saw at work in Gramoven. And this was one thing we were curious is if this notion of dual power, particularly around housing, could be transferred to Vancouver, and what scale it might take place at. So historically, dual power, which is deriving from a concept of Lenin, which was hammered on, harshly critiqued by Trotsky, is seen as both transitional, in the movement towards proletarian rule, which is Lenin's position, but on the other hand, seen as self-contradictory by Trotsky. Trotsky believed there could never be a moment of shared power. However, like many concepts from the past, it's arisen again. George Cicerello Meyer gives a sense of what it means in the context of Venezuela today. He writes, specifically, what is unique about the Venezuelan situation is the fact that sectors of the state are working actively to dismantle and dissolve the old state apparatus by devolving power to local organs capable of constituting a dual power. Transcending the simplistic debate between taking or opposing state power, a focus on dual power allows us to concentrate on what really matters in Venezuela and elsewhere, the revolutionary transformation of existing repressive structures. So in that quote from Meyer there, you hear the echoes of many debates that are taking place at the moment. And so we were interested in the way that this notion of dual power, where the idea of the notion of autogestion moves from New Belgrade, is transformed under new conditions in Caracas in Venezuela, and then this form of dual power emerges out of that. So we were really trying to investigate the way that housing and self-organization of everyday life we were looking at we wanted to see what art could do in terms of representing that, as Sabina said, but also in recirculating it. So one aspect of this exhibition that we like to emphasize is the publicness of it. So we had several panel discussions, as we said, but also we had a talk with the geographer Neil Smith on a work that he was just in the midst of developing on the notion of the revolutionary imperative. So carrying forward or elaborating this notion of publicness, one other project that we did that was previous to Vivo was a show called We Declare Spaces of Housing. And this exhibition was at the Gallery Gachet in 2008, and it addressed the sites and institutions where decisions and declarations regarding housing are made. So instead of showing the problem of housing through a documentary mode, we used photographs as spatial elements, ranging from Vancouver communities to Vancouver City Hall to the provincial capital of Victoria, up to the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. So site-specific installation brought these spaces of symbolic and real power into the gallery through large-scale photo-based murals. The different scales of decision-making of these places was made equal through the symbolic participation in place. So we tried to flatten and at the same time highlight those relations of power, of decisions that these different sites had through spatial elements and through photography. At the time, we described this project as a platform, a mixing machine, and a declaration that begins with the notion of art practices as an imperfect yet necessary form of public research in a time when the spaces and ideas of what and where the public might be are under pressures. So accordingly, with We Declare, we launched, primarily through Amjo Hall's assertion, the Vancouver Flying University, and we had a month-long program at Gallery Gachet that ranged from discussions on housing, gentrification, culture in general, and also the notion of the right to the city. There was panels on First Nations housing issues, on artist collaborations, and as art as a public research-based sort of public voice. And we tried to flatten out or democratize the notion of the production of knowledge through that project as well.
Okay. Oh. You skipped some things. Okay. Let me go quick through here. So, the university is also a site which we work through different moments in the project. One larger work was engaging with an archive. The title for all of the works is University Paradox. And the work started with proposing the university as an architectural place on one hand and a contested site of education, knowledge, and academia on the other hand. From 2009 on, intensive conflicts have been arising from the education versus training debate, specifically in Austria and the rest of Europe, and then have been joined by protests in the Anglo-American world. There was also lots of protests in Berkeley, New York, but then also later in Latin America. The university paradox deals with representation-critical aspects of this conflict. Documents, documentation, media presence, and the question of which group are mediatizing their respective interests. In particular, we looked at the history of student strikes, university occupations, and campus politics from the late 60s to today to link the student strikes at the end of 2009 in Vienna with the late 60s actions at SFU. So this was Vienna, 2009, and SFU in the 60s. So from an aesthetic standpoint, the question posed is that of how historical and current documents and documentation can become materials of image and space production. An exemplary setting for the work was an architecturally distinctive Simon Fraser University campus up in Burnaby. So to make this, we went to the official SFU archive. And the use of archive has as we know, intensified in recent photographic practices. And also, Ellen Sekula contributed really important notions about that. Sekula says, archives then constitute a territory of images. The unity of an archive is first and foremost that imposed by ownership. Thus, not only are the pictures in archives often literally for sale, but their meanings are up for grabs. So the idea of the possibility of meaning liberated from the archive and generating new meanings was kind of a key point for us. So looking at some material in the archive, which also holds the Peak student paper, the photo archive, and also we had intense long discussions with Jerry Zaslow about the history of SFU. We, at one point, really got intrigued by the visual quality of the material. So this original photo was taken by reporters for the Peak, and it documents one of the demonstrations that were part of a conflict known as the Templeton 5 affair. University assistants who had voiced their political opinions outside the university, they were fired by the Senate. And later on, following massive protests as well as statements of support by professors, they were reinstated in their jobs. And all of us being admirers of Arthur Erickson's architectural ambition, it was really interesting to see how the Peak's photograph uses the architecture to create an idea of almost an utopia, or at least a social optimistic. So in this large-scale wallpaper, again, the crowds of students, demonstrators, are dropped out of the image and seen only in the silhouettes in the back there, against the dramatic perspective of the modernist university campus. And the images of the students on aluminum honeycomb, those panels that separate the architecture and protesting students and instructors, they are distributed throughout the gallery. So this separation also addresses the relationship of students, instructors, and administrators to the institution, a relationship which is constantly renegotiated and permanently newly produced. And then the second part of this university paradox works was called Events Are Always Original. And it's a 9-part black and white photo series, which also uses an archival material from the university. And in contrast, the photographs were taken by the university administration to document the damage to and use of the administrative spaces during the occupation of the administration building. So in November 1968, the group Students for a Democratic University, SDU, initiated a sit-in with 180 students of the administrative building. After 65 hours, the students were forcibly removed from the building in the middle of the night by 100 police officers. So the conflicts and contradictions between the ideologies of administrating the educational system and the demands of the students for institutional autonomy, for free education and research, are readable in the picture's captions, which are excerpts of the slogans and notes in the depicted spaces. Can you read it? General meeting, 9:15. Back to power politics like good revolutionaries. So all of the texts we made into these documents, that was text from seen in the image. And this was photographed by the administration. So these works also address the archive as a contested site. The documents are produced and therefore they're of course not neutral. It becomes obvious that the same event is seen through the illogical frames, from the very optimistic outside of the Peak cover, from this optimistic vision to a crime scene from the administration.
Also, in doing that archival work, the archivists at the SFU archive were extremely helpful and excited because we, ironically, had been the first people who had gone into the archive of the photo of the Peak, which at that time was a progressive paper. And actually they had terrific photographers.
And negatives, film
that's
negatives.
Right.
Oh, so beautiful. Contact sheets, film material.
So moving kind of forward with this relationship between the archive and the university, we're going to talk about a project that we were involved at Leuphana University in Lunenburg in northern Germany, where we were artists in residence for a year. We began this as an artistic research project called filling the weak points, which is a phrase taken from Lefebvre's work on autogestion, where he sees this withdrawal of the Keynesian state opens these weak spaces where autogestion can move into. We began to look at forms of self-organization in that area of northern Germany. We wanted to look for historical instances of this, as well as what had arisen in reaction to the economic crash and the very high housing prices in that area, particularly around Hamburg. Our idea was to find forms of social organizing and movements which, as Marina Citrin describes them, create the future in the present. So we hope to find self-organization in the anti-nuclear protests that began in the late 1970s in that area, particularly in a site called Wendland. This site, where spent nuclear containers, mostly from France, are stored, was briefly the site of a Free Republic protest site. It was a camp and a village that was self-organized to keep out the construction of this storage facility. So they occupied, so to speak, the site. The nuclear waste was to be stored in the unused salt mines of the area. And Lunenburg was one of the cities that was central to the salt economy at that time and part of the Hanseatic League. The Free Republic of Wendland, as it was called, had its own passport as well as its own hippie ethics and aesthetics. It was brutally taken down by police in a military operation that descended in helicopters and breached the walls of this little utopian ramshackle village, in a sense. So the idea of the Free Republic exists in the area today. It's still palpable. Many cars and bikes have stickers proclaiming the Free Republic of Wendland, and the students we worked with on the project have a cultural history of it that they carried down from their parents. One person brought her mother's passport that she had from the Free Republic of Wendland. Another site called Brockdorf, where a massive protest took place trying to block the building of a nuclear power plant, was even more violent, and it's credited with the initial clash of anarchists, leftists, and the police that resulted in the development of the Black Bloc tactic. The shock of the police violence called for new tactics that were met force with force. Yet others of their tactics were there to confound the police. It was a community protest through and through. People carried balloons in the festive atmosphere. Yet they strategically used these balloons as floating devices that could potentially bring down the helicopters. So when they released the balloons, the helicopters left the area because they knew that the helicopters were going to be central to the police siege. And this action led to the banning of balloons at protests in Germany at the time. So we also investigated the self-managed squats in Lunenburg and the anti-gentrification movements in Hamburg, which Jamie Peck referred to as well. Yet after more research and seminars with the students, we realized that our research without guarantees really was without any guarantees, and we felt that we had essentially failed in that initial plan, and there simply wasn't enough self-organizing to sustain the project. But from the research we'd done, we decided to shift our focus to the tactics, militant and otherwise, of the anti-nuclear protests and the visual language of the protests, because they were still everywhere in this area. Now, this led us to the archives of the German news magazine Der Spiegel, which is in Hamburg. This led us to a consideration of what Hal Foster terms the archival impulse in contemporary art. He describes it that in the first instance, archival artists seek to make historical information, often lost or displaced, physically present. And beyond that, Foster proposes that artists are often drawn to unfulfilled beginnings or incomplete projects in history and art alike that might offer a point of departure again. Now, there was a debate going on where, to counter Foster, Dieter Rohlstrate, in the text called After the Historiographic Turn, he sassily proposes that, but there does seem certainly to exist a connection between, on the one hand, the reluctance to theorize the present moment in art, let alone its future, and on the other, the massive amounts of art made today concerned with yesterday. Our inability to either think or simply imagine the future seems structurally linked with the enthusiasm shared by so many artists for digging up various obscure odds and ends dating from a more or less remote, unknowable past. And the more unknowable the past in question, the deeper the pathological dimension of this melancholy retrospective gaze. He's being fairly rhetorical on this, I think. Yet, we didn't find, obviously, Rohlstrate's position or Foster's particularly satisfying. Foster's identification of a tendency within art and Rohlstrate's zero-sum game of the past and the present. Particularly in other archival research, we saw how ideas and arguments from the past had been powerfully picked up and recirculated. So that was one structural aspect from that research on autogestion, and the way that they've been recirculated into new conditions and contexts and brought into the present. So to cancel that relationship of the opening of the future by the struggles of, to cancel the relationship of the opening of the future by the struggles of the past denied, we felt, the particular future of new social movements. We also believed that a neoliberal euphoria, by my book, of the present, sorry, we were joking earlier about this, so we also believe that a neoliberal euphoria of the present and their end of history thesis, which is itself a recirculation, was a catalyst in sending artists to return to the past as a form of critique of the present and as a form of imagining another future. In contrast, we consider Sharon Hayes' proposition more useful than Foster or Rohlstrate. She writes, "If I, as an artist, disrupt the spatial and temporal assumptions that underlie our understanding of what events, persons, objects, and actions constitute our realm of experience, can I construct, even for a brief period of time, a space in which it is possible to consider the future, our expectations of what is to come, and our own position and responsibility toward the explosive unpredictability of 2011, 2012, 2013, and beyond, already in the past." So in assembling our archival images, I just jumped over to Sabina's section. Sorry.
Assembling the images. Images is our part. So doing that, we began to more strongly question the reliance of the indexicality of the image in recent artwork that dealt with protest. We also started to erode the boundary between exhibition and archive and between artwork and historical document. So for the exhibition at the Lüneburg Kunstraum, we brought in also posters from an archive of anti-nuclear materials that we saw as having a beautiful minimalist or a conceptual aesthetic. And rather than display them in a separate space with the research material, we had them in the exhibition space to emphasize also their aesthetic value, so it would not be overridden by its indexical aspect. Yet, indexicality for these works is also really powerful. They worked in particular as signifiers for the communities at the time, and they carry a great signifier and weight today. So for the exhibition, we also got in touch with a photographer whose images of that time were iconic. His name is Günther Zint from Hamburg, and he was a photographer for Spiegel, but also he worked with Günter Wallraff. So he just moved studios and was happy to mail us original photos, stamped photos, and print on Barit paper. And from the Der Spiegel archive, we had the original press photo that showed the cropping lines, as well as the information that journalists and photographers had written on the back of the photos. And then for the exhibition, we produced a series of black and white photographs that showed the backs of the press photographs in different combinations, because they were always describing the scene in the front, which was not really very descriptive sometimes. So that is their semantic frame, which were written on the back, were what we wanted to foreground. We also wanted to resist the easy drama or representational force of these photos. We questioned whether they had become part of a protest paradigm in the representation of protest. We also did not think that an unmediated move of an image from archive to artwork was necessarily enough to set new relations in motion or to generate those new relations. From Foster, we took the exhibition as an archival situation. Finally, the work in question is archival since it not only draws on informal archives, but produces them as well, and does so in a way that underscores the nature of all archival material as found yet constructed, factual yet fictive, public yet private. And the archive actually really was in permanent use with students and with visitors of the gallery. So people actually brought in more material or partially rearranged some of the settings which the students had mapped out on the wall. So the organization and display of multiple archival material in the show, ranging from a mass of copies of images from the archives combined with text we provided for the seminars in the archive or reading room, created an effective relationship for members of the audience who remembered either their personal engagement in those moments of struggle. So people did study the photos at the opening, brought in things. There was a little screening possibility also. And in the main gallery in the front of the Kunstraum, which was built during the Nazi regime, and the Kunstraum itself has a really interesting history of place-based, site-specific, and critically engaged art project. So we used, as an architectural detail of the gallery space, a large beam that was used to hold wrenches that lifted the engines out of Nazi tanks as a spatial aspect of this site-specific wallpaper work. The work turned into an image of a campus building, which was originally a Nazi garrison building, turned it upside down. This photographic defamiliarization evokes the photographic process, camera obscura, as well as turns the relatively hidden history of the campus on its head. Cutting through the image and aligned with the central beam of the original building is the shape of the anti-tank device that was used to block tanks' access to different roads. And we saw a similarity with this anti-tank device with also the sign of yellow X's that stand as anti-nuclear waste symbols and which are seen throughout the area. And we just in the hectic today, we couldn't find a photo of it. But there's a similarity to that. Those yellow X's are fixed on roofs of houses, painted on facades or stickers around. A second wallpaper tried to play out the invisibility of the actual nuclear waste storage facility and its site, the low wooded land of the era, which had been stripped of trees for use as fuel in the production of salt and then replanted. The relationship of the pastoral and the nuclear, of the pastoral and the military, was in our mind in this work that was when you walked through the research room. So the exhibition proposed that the militant image is not in itself an image of protest nor of moments of vital social upheaval, but an image that is complex of relations and that imagines links from the present to future social actors, or, in the words of Simon Critchley, an image that imagines the multiplication of social actors. From this, we move to our present project, which will be a curated exhibition around the notion of the militant image. The name of this exhibition was called Front Field Line Plain, subtitle Researching the Militant Image.
So this project that we're going to be realizing next fall at Kammer Austria in Graz is called the Militant Image. It's a working title. So we got together with the curator of the gallery and editor of the magazine, Reinhard Braun, and we had a kind of a 2-day intensive in a hotel that was more or less completely empty. It felt like we were working through The Shining, through a filming of The Shining, more or less. So, taking that opportunity, we decided not to use any blunt instruments, but rather to write a manifesto of sorts, which is interesting as a collaborative project because you take a particular tone in it. So we thought we'd just end briefly with some of our thinking, this manifesto around the militant image, which is working towards a description of the exhibition and the colloquium. What would the militant image look like today? The conditions that provoke militancy are no longer given, therefore the conventions of the militant image are also not given. The militant image is less an index of social optimism and struggle of a people or a group against the state or the state of things, but an image that provokes a constellation of social alliances and affects that react to the present. The militant image proposes that a new condition of the image responds to the radically uneven condition of the present. The militant image is an aesthetic remodeling that leads, or even hopes to lead to, the constellation of socially and politically charged affects that then lead to militancy. The stability of the representation of militancy and of political art is productively troubled by the accelerating conditions of precarity, economic and spatial injustice, and new forms of colonization. Can the condition of precarity and the actions of decolonization be the conditions that the militant image must confront in order to be militant? By militant, we point to material and affective alliances which both make demands against the state and turn their back on the state as the site of all politics. Is the militant image productively unstable in reaction to, even in solidarity with, new forms of instability and precarity? In difference to previous imaginations of the militant image today is not fully in control of the field of visuality. It is less the spectacular production of subjects than a step toward shaping agency through the production and circulation of images. The militant image cannot be militant on its own. It is dialogic, and as Bakhtin said of the word, the militant image is half someone else's. Therefore, the militant image is not self-identical with itself. Is the militant image a reaction to new modes of governance and can be rethought of as the art of not being governed like that? So that's where we'd like to end our speculations for tonight. So thanks very much.
I feel like you left it as an unanswered question whether or not you could find an example of dual power within the context of Vancouver.
Well, I know that the Downtown Neighbourhood Council was talking about it. That was one thing that they had as a discussion point. But I guess, one of the propositions of all this type of work is not just how would, a form of dual power that we have a definition from the past be brought forward into the present, but how it might also take another shape. So we didn't find an example of exactly how dual power would be working in Vancouver, but we did see groups that were working towards that as a notion. And the key thing that we felt was that the dual power was not seen as simply a transitory phase, but rather could be a condition that continued. I guess if we were a bit more generous or less strict in the definition of it too, we could rescale it, or in a sense, down to more into different relationships, or to think of how dual power might work between institutions and individuals, or institutions and groups, as opposed to strictly self-organized. But I mean, with a lot of the work that we've done and a lot of the way that we choose things to look at is almost like brief flare-ups of potential utopias, or utopian moments. We do have, unfortunately, a bit of a utopian strain. And I think that we were, by being in Venezuela at that moment, we were really captivated with the possibility of how they were managing this relationship between self-organizing and the state, and also how it was transforming gender relations there as well, which was also part of the Constitution of Venezuela, which is it the first neutral one and first gender-neutral constitution?
The first gender-written constitution ever, I think. Yeah. But I mean, it's similar like dual power, but also our search for autogestion. When we made this book, we were searching in Belgrade for where is this form of autogestion. And the form of self-organizing you found was the worst way of turbo capitalism. People just take what they can. It was self-organized because the state structures were falling apart. And so, of course, that's not what we were looking for. Where's an emancipatory way of finding that? And at the end, we decided that we only, for the artist edition, for the covers, we only work off of sites where the idea of autogestion was either implemented, so it's the state, what is it called, the governmental space of ex-Yugoslavia, where it was implemented from, and a Roma settlement, I don't know if you saw this in the photos, which we would on its own not take as a great exemplary site for self-management, because it's just not. But so we worked then our way through and could not find the site or the image which actually represents that.
But if I could kind of step back a moment to the dual power piece, I wonder, given the title of your show at Vivo and given the content, if it's an architectural problem, if it's actually that there isn't a space for dual power. There might be people willing to enact it, but there's not the kind of agency that's provided through something like that incredible apartment building, which you've documented before in Venezuela.
Right. Could be a spatial question, although, working with space, we have to be careful also not to essentialize it, not to have an architectural or spatial determinant, but rather we would tend to look at like human actions as being able to overcome the spatial determinants or architectural determinants. But maybe one reason why dual power is so hard to achieve is exactly that contradiction within it that Trotsky in early works was pointing out, which is you're always going to have an uneven relationship. So I guess dual power becomes, as we kind of ironically point out, it becomes, in these two instances of Yugoslavia and Venezuela, it's come top down. It was the state that started the process of dual power in order to rearrange the relationship between the state and the citizens. So I don't think we have in North America a state that would imagine doing that in any way. So that perhaps Trotsky in the end was right about that. Thanks.
Oh, that was very rich. So much to think about, and it was quite dense too. So it's like, whoa. There was a silence. I think it's because there was a lot to think about. I'm wondering, in the context of neoliberalism, if you could triangulate three things that you talked about: poetic research, and the university, the idea of the university, and in particular the place of pedagogy. And if you think about the protests that you were speaking of in terms of training versus education, the particular place of art and poetry, and the fact that Helmut, I know that sometimes you also teach, but that Jeff and Sabine, your professors here at SFU. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Do you feel particularly utopic? And also, what is the possibilities of sustaining open, it's not necessarily open-ended, as you say, in a kind of vacuous way, but in a way that's truly creates possibilities rather than predetermine them, right. And doesn't instrumentalize knowledge in terms of skills training, etc. So I just want to hear you speak more about it, because it's something I think about a lot.
Right. Well, the one part when we looked at, because we do go back and forth, and Helmut lives in Vienna, so we do go back and forth between those two cities. And in 2009, it was incredible what happened in Europe with the universities because of the implementation of the Bologna process, so that it will be all generalized and and made normatives through these new regulations. And students were, we were at 3 a.m. in the main lecture hall at the University in Vienna, and there was thousands of people. It was incredible. And it was crowded for quite a while. And it was, I don't know what the conditions, do they have to be so bad, but they are not really so horrible in Europe compared to, other places. There's also a great Tom Hollett writes about why it is actually within the art academy where the whole thing started. It is art which takes on this critical framework or this critical urgency and does something about it. I don't know, with the one work where we went through the archive in Vancouver, the contemporary conditions in Vienna, and the contemporary conditions at SFU, where there were also some very small protests. To me, it was really revealing the kind of slogan which we pointed out, what they were asking for. It was a bit of a joke, but at SFU it was a bailout for the universities. And that's not really answering.
Yeah, there was those two particular slogans which you could see how the protest in Vienna and the protest at SFU were situated. One was kind of overall structural transformation, and I think the SFU one was sort of like stop taking things away or something, like along those lines.
But we were also talking about, this term of, the last week or the last days, autonomy was always such a contested term, and, Helmut and I constantly asking for autonomy. But I also think the universities, if you can claim some kind of autonomy towards the, government, you're in trouble, of course.
Also in Vienna at the present moment, too, was the Art Academy made an alliance with refugee groups, and there was one group of refugees who'd been getting shunted around from spaces in the city to different spaces by the police, and so the Art Academy opened itself up to house the refugees, and the art students have become central now in making an argument for refugee rights and trying to change laws within Austria. So I think that kind of moment of politicization of, let's say, the super instrumentalization through the Bologna process, where education, particularly art education, was being rationalized and moving towards training. The end result of that becomes you have a very politicized group of art students in the city who are, making links between their particular struggle and struggles of other people, including refugees. So in that sense, that's that kind of outsiders inside sort of move that we've been trying to think through. And that becomes the pressure that politicizes education as well. So maybe the pedagogy happens in the other way. Maybe it's the students who are educating the university. And as people who work with me perhaps get tired of hearing, I think that from a poetics position, we always have a moment of radical openness. We just have to pay attention to what the forces are that close down those moments, as opposed to feel that there's a continual moment of closure and then look for breaches in it. I really, from a poetic position, I think that's the one that doesn't abandon politics, but I think that's more the case. It's a miracle that things get stopped, and that's what we have to pay attention to.
Well, it seems more and more important that we fight for that kind of possibilities, especially like in the studio and the seminars, and just having conversations. And I think increasingly it seems that those spaces are not important or interesting or useful in terms of financialization and the whole kind of economic rationality to existence itself that you're talking about. And
but
I think that's something to fight for.
It's also an interesting move. I noticed it more in Vienna than in Vancouver when, through lots of funding of art institutions, a loss of funding in the art institutions, the universities were not in the very forefront of being cut. So there was actually quite an interesting move within the art world from the art institutions towards the academy and towards the educational institutions. And that, I think, went also parallel with the idea of artistic research. So that became more a practice of artists, not so much to, get into all of these collections, but be part of the big funding projects of artistic research. So I think that is also, and then the academy and the art institutions, the educational institution, actually opened up quite a bit agency and potential and possibilities for this kind of works. At the same time, the danger that this is going to be instrumentalized and made into just one other commodity, if it's not the idea of artistic research and knowledge production as a commodity and as a market.
I think what happens with some of those possibilities, and it's not to be pessimistic at all, but right. They become they're not poetic research. They're very, the object of knowledge is already known, right. And it's already written towards that. The grants, the whole infrastructure, and the momentum is from that stance, and you see the outcome of certain kinds of projects like that, and they're quite cynical compared to what you're talking about. Right. But anyway, I don't want to monopolize this. I just find what you're talking about so important, in the way we're kind of living our institutional lives and our relations within them. One other thing I do want to say is, and it's more rhetorical, is that out of curiosity is like, what places are you looking for this militant image? Where does it exist, and how does it exist? And I guess that's the process of research, correct?
Right, right.
Okay. All right. Anyone else?
I don't think we ever went through the framework of location, where it is. But one of the works we kind of, in the discussions, always came back to is a video from 1967.
68.
Or 68, from Harun Farooqi, where he talks about, what is it called? The unextinguishable, das unlöschbare Feuer.
The unextinguishable fire.
Right. Right.
Which is like a half-an-hour video that he made during the Vietnam War. It's about napalm, but also about protest. And there's the opening it's on YouTube, you can find it, but in the opening 5 minutes, he more or less lays out the problematic of what political images and the making of political images can possibly be. It ends with him putting out a cigarette on his arm to prove a point, but it just seems to stand as a particular moment. That project I don't think is going to be so archival, but we're trying to think through a bit more this notion of the militant image being half someone else's, using that notion from Bakhtin, moving that forward, and then trying to think through the kind of affective alliances that relationship might imply. So one way that we got to the militant image was through the notion of militant research and looking at the way that that's been mobilized in Argentina since the late 90s, anyhow, and thinking through the kind of the way that very optimistically militant research talks about the production of militant subjects, and looking at post-colonial film from that was seen as like the militant image. There's an issue of Third Text on that. We were, which also has the impulse that the image will produce a particular type of social subject, and we were just trying to work through how would a social subject be so readily produced today, or is that the goal of a militant image? So we're thinking more along, without getting wishy-washy, but thinking more along the lines of kind of affective alliances, as opposed to this one-to-one production of a militant subject. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and also it's about one emphasis we have is on circulation as opposed to the image itself.
Right. Right.
Hi there. I was really interested in the way that you use archival material as present-day artwork. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the presentation of archival material isn't enough, and you seem to have developed certain strategies to represent archival material as artwork. So are there certain strategies that you tend to use more than others? Are there, or is that dependent on the the subject matter that you find in the archives?
That really depends on the subject matter. With the SFU archive, if we would not have found the total difference between the peak representation of student uprising and then the administration with the crime photos, if it would not have been so clear what we found there, then that was a really interesting way we had to take on. But with Lüneburg, for example, it was really much more like almost like one of the 90s project, where it was a room filled with material which partially students found and put together in different sections and research chapters, because it was really a working archive. We worked there with 3 faculties, and they had courses around these themes, and then students went to Hamburg to the archive a few times. So they found out, and students wrote paper in a really interesting way, what this archive, or what this photograph then did. There was, for example, this one photograph of 2 protesters hitting with a wood bar a cop in the head when he was trying to climb up out of this pit. And that photograph was used by the German state, actually, totally strategic to criminalize the whole anti-atomic movement. And it actually ended up that the 2 guys got charged with attempted murder, and not just. So that was really interesting. And at that time, of course, there was not so many photographers. Günther Zinn was really one of the few who was always on site. And then that photo, how that showed up with different subtitles. And that was really interesting. But it was kind of a working archive. So students mapped it out, what they found out, put it in different sections. So that was a working archive to be used. So I don't think we have one strategy. But always, of course, it's like, what can you do with it now? How can it relate to?
I think one way that we think through the strategies of representation was, in talking with people, so in one way you're confronted with the archival image, and then you bring this image out, as we did for the show, and then you start meeting all these people who know the greater context of the image itself. So I think some of the work that we tried to do was to show the construction, or like all of those discourses and positions and the construction of the image that aren't in the image itself. So, showing the back of the press photos and the description that they have of those images, because they're very common images. So the kind of I think the small challenge that we had to the viewers was that you could look at the back of this photograph, the original press photograph, and through the description you would be able to find the original photo, and there was always a disjuncture between it.
Right. But then there were a couple of students who actually also did the research about the language used in relation to that. That was like war language, what on the back of the photos, but in these articles it was all the battlefield and the weapons and.
Right. There's a video of the police raid on Ventland. And it really is, it's like, as if, those kinds of images you might recall from like Woodstock, where it's all like idyllic, people are playing in the mud and dancing, and then suddenly these helicopters just descend and take everything down. So it was still really quite active and fresh in people's imaginations. And I think that we did feel that, these modes, or like you're saying, like the strategies of presenting the images, were not really so much to get a kind of critical distance from them so they could be seen in a fresh way, but to try and just rejig them a bit so they could circulate again in a different mode.
So the imagery is always a result of the research, finally. Because the more you delve into the archival work, the more you discover about the history of the images themselves, and that ends up creating new strategies for you to present the work.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Great,
We even had like one person who brought their personal photo album of, that they, lovingly had for like 30 years. Here's me and my friends getting clubbed by police at Brockdorf.
But then all kind of drawn around little flowers and a very neatly made, crafted book, but then this brutal, police album.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. It was great. I have a question, is a bit of a broad question, but I'm especially interested by your interdisciplinary nature within the collective, but more specifically, and Jeff and Sabine, I know you better in relationship to your sort of other professional side, which is your relationship to the university and the interdisciplinarity of the university. And I guess I'm curious about the way that a collective allows you to work across boundaries and to create a sort of a coherent body of work, and if that is also apparent in your university sort of everyday life, or if the collective allows you to go further in that. And in forming a collective, are you then able to re-enter the university with a new type of agency that you wouldn't necessarily have as just an individual teacher who's seeking someone else in another department to work with? So I guess that's part of the question, but also just interested in the importance of pedagogy in your work, not in terms of specifically the work, but as in your relationship to your university position, because obviously there is a constant link towards ideas of shift and generational shifts, and I'm really interested in this, your commitment essentially to Simon Fraser, to students, and how you find that translating itself in the work, but also in your full-time position as a faculty member on staff.
Well, I think for the first two questions that you asked would be like, first, escape valve would be one way to describe it. And then the goal is not necessarily to reinsert ourselves and reinvigorate ourselves back into the institution. But, we tend to generate too much material. So we do have things that we cut out of the talk, and some of that was talking about, we do take inspiration from the research that, actually that book that we cited, The Constituent Imagination, and where the notion of research is moved outside of institutions essentially, and the importance for that. So I think that our goal is not necessarily to loop back into, in a stronger form, back into the institution, but to move more broadly from it. One rather long section that we cut out was Brian Holmes's notion of event works, this four-step movement of event work. It sort of goes from artwork to event work. And so I think in some ways that might be the answer to the question, that we would see, like if you know the text, I'll just say in a shorthand way that we might see the work that we're doing collaboratively as a kind of event work, as opposed to creating a space for ourselves within the confines of an institution. But I have to say also, I tend not to think of the university strictly simply as an institution, but rather as a workplace. And I think then that shifts like a politics for me, because it's also about the politics of a workplace. How do you, here's folks you got to work with, and how do you figure out how to do that? Where do you take particular stands? I think sometimes just only having it figured as a institution tends to abstract it a little bit. And also then it plays into the whole class politics of professors, which is completely bogus. I don't know, Sabine, if you wanted to add.
Sometimes I would actually really like to think of the university as a workplace where I just go and then I go home and then I do somebody else. But I don't know, through where I come from and how I'm socialized and how me and Hamber are working as artists, we always approach things as projects, which really, that is so hard when you work in an institution because it's not your project. And I constantly keep myself finding that I should shift my perception on that, because I could really, go dive into it and not come up anymore.
Our shorthand joke on it is, the project of live-work becomes work-live. Right. So it's like artist lofts. Right.
But I think that's really difficult to what kind of place do you give that? I mean, the university obviously has an agency, provides an agency or a place for really interesting things to happen. But I think it would be diminishing if it just see it as a workplace and not engage in a more open way. But at the same time, keep your...
Right. Yeah, I guess like the kind of perfect storm in a sense that can happen without Mark Wahlberg is that you have the institutional critique of conceptual art and a bit of institutions, and then that moves into the academy. And I think we all know the extreme absorptive powers of institutions, but how do, in the one way, how do you think of strategies around that? And, one way I think we've tried to, degrees of success and lack of success is to, insist on collaboration as not producing the same kind of value as like individual research, for instance, and also just troubling that individuation of research, and then also not just seeing interdisciplinarity as a moment where two forms of knowledge get together, but rather seeing it in a more transformative way. Like what happens when you bring these two forms of knowledge together and then you recognize they're antagonistic, and then you have to figure out a way how they're going to work together, and then keeping in mind that you're always going to be driven towards particular outcomes, as the shirk is always pointing us towards. And so in one way to resist that outcome in a sense. So it's like, it plays off a bit of a politics of recognition. At what point do you want to be recognized? At what point do you want to tamper with the politics of recognition within an institutional discourse? So yeah, big question. Thanks.
Unsolved.
Well, I have a small question, and I was just wondering if you could comment on your strategy, just kind of working from Stefan's question on your use of archival images, of your strategy of integrating some of them site-specifically and working with the architectural elements of the gallery or of the presentation spaces that you were presenting them in?
Well, that was also coming out of this idea that an image doesn't have to be just an image, but it creates a space through the experience. So specifically with the SFU, with the peak photograph, to kind of split the actors and the architecture, we kind of symbolically open up the space for potential engagement within this site and take the place of the people in that architecture. But also this idea, which we are really intrigued by, that space is not a given, but its space is constantly produced by social act and movement and people moving through space. So that we wanted to alter the representation of space. We wanted to not only trouble but open up as a spatial possibility.
I mean, one aspect of research that Helmut and Sabina focused on in that Leuphana project was to look at the architectural details of these former garrison buildings and where the gallery was, which was essentially a workshop that they worked on tanks. And the question became like, how is that history still visible in the architectural details? And through that research and talking with somebody on the campus, one way that it was visible was in the width of the doors, and that the doors, every corner was rounded.
But that was not in any way representative for something militaristic. The problem we had was that was a garrison which was built as a camouflaged housing place, that it cannot be seen from the planes above, so that it cannot be bombed.
It would look like housing.
It would look like housing, and the trees were planted, and it was basically camouflaged as a really nice housing, open, like it was done in Germany then. And we were kind of really suggested to, you always engage with architecture and the kind of ideology behind it. And it was so incredible hard because you couldn't see anything. And if you work with imagery and photographs, it was basically impossible. So that's why we kind of took the one existing, the Kunstraum itself, as this tank workshop with the abstracted, well, you actually see it here, with the abstracted tank cross as a possibility to bring that in, because you could not, in a photograph, show any of this militaristic history.
We also tried to do some work with the campus is going to have a Frank Gehry building on it, And it's taken, which they want to have as their signature building and for branding the university globally. But I guess they kind of dragged their heels on it, and there was some corruption around how they were going to pay for the building. And so Gary made the same building somewhere else in China. So now their signature building that they're going to brand themselves with exists somewhere else already. So we were very much pushed in a direction towards doing something about that. But
then at the same time, it was impossible to do anything because you couldn't be for it, but you also could not be against it. There was like a lose-lose situation. So we totally had hands off. Because Libeskind was, of course, really attacked by the...
right.
Oh, like you said,
Gary.
Gary. Yeah, no, it was Libeskind, but then there was the right wing totally against that. And yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.